Welcome to the Tank Podcast. In this episode, Susan Ploetz speaks to Guy Mackinnon-Little about collaborative world building, the limits of VR, and alternatives to a social sphere marked by distrust and disintegration.
Yeah, so I thought just to begin briefly, if you can maybe just introduce yourself and say a bit about what it is that you do for people who might not have sort of encountered your practice before.
So I'm Susan Ploetz, and what do I do? I combine techniques and approaches from somatics and mind-body centering types of practices with real life simulation, so using a lot from like Nordic live action role play, especially doing like co-created kind of world building. And I think for me what's very important is the facilitation process, and that we build up safety and like a shared sense of kind of agency within that world, and that there's a space that we exit together. I don't know, I think that's a very potent space itself, that we can communally like create a situation together and then also have some feedback about how it was so that people are brought into like an experience design framework instead of having everything designed for them.
Yeah, I think that's it's such an expansive introduction, but I guess there's so much to touch on. But I'm interested as well in sort of like what your process looks like when you're sort of putting these things together, where there's something important about almost like decentering yourself and allowing it to be this process of collaborative storytelling where these different elements can be brought together. I guess I was thinking about the kind of like the paradigm of these things and how different kind of like imaginative frameworks can shift how you relate to, you know, your identity and the people around you and so on and so forth. And it made me think of, in his book, MSV's Guide to Worlding, Ian Cheng talks about his kind of artistic process and breaks it down in terms of these different masks you would inhabit, which allow you to kind of access different parts of your identity, or kind of destroys this kind of myth of the artist as a unitary creator, and says like, well, if you look past that and like acknowledge these competing tendencies in yourself for like order and disruption and novelty and like chaos and all these different kind of like streams which can drive the creation of an artwork or an object or whatever, there's a rhyme between what's being described there and, you know, I guess the sort of the ethos of LARP of inhabiting these different perspectives and kind of trying to shift towards a more kind of like ecological understanding of selfhood. And yeah, I guess so with that in mind, I think it'd be good to like sort of hear more about when you kind of like try to dream up these games and these systems and these exercises, what that kind of looks like.
It's nice because I feel like I can really let my imagination run free, and then know that as long as I give like concrete things for the participants to do, that then they'll take it wherever their imaginations will take it. The process is gathering inspiration and then sitting down and figuring out what is what, like what part of the LARP could this be? Is this kind of background? Is this story? Is this scenography? Is this mechanisms? So mechanisms are how people interact with the world or each other, how you build the simulation together, and how you like act in it. And yeah, I just have to think about like what is playable. Like it has to be quite simple in the end. And what helps, it either is helping the fiction forward, or it's helping character development or relationship development. It's a building of a world, but it's also an inquiry. Like I have always a question, like, and lots of it is like, will this work? So it was somatics. It was like, can I use somatic techniques to simulate this alien culture that I feel like has a lot to do with like what we do as somatic practitioners? And with Sasanel, I think my question was, can I like research into how other cultures deal with the environment, or how is that related to linguistics in a way? And like, what is magic as a way to like communicate with nature and the environment? What is nature and the environment when you're in different worlds? And the question was more like, can that be communicated? And what would that look like if people were operating, people that I knew and people in the West, basically Europe, especially, like, how would they interact with the environment and each other if that was like their cosmology that they were working from?
Yeah, it might be good just to sort of like kind of like anchor like what exactly those two projects that you just described sort of were in a kind of very like concrete, straightforward way.
So Xenosomatics is a LARP I've written that's exploring the world set forth by Octavia Butler in her Xenogenesis or Lilith's Brood trilogy, and especially building up to this mechanism of simulating the mating ritual in that book between the aliens. And so the aliens in that book, if you haven't read it, there's 3 genders, male, female, and Uloi, and they always mate in 3s. And so I wanted to see, the Uloi is like a very powerful healer and knowledge gatherer through lots of nonverbal and like sensory like knowledge gathering techniques, I guess. And so I wanted to see if I could use the sensory like awareness and sensory information gathering tools that we have in somatics practices to simulate the Uloi and that experience and like this kind of different culture of the aliens. And then Sassanel is a LARP I've written about an island, a group of islanders that have a kind of magic materialism. So they interact with the materiality of their world in a very potent way. And they are experiencing climate change on their island, and they are thinking it's coming from the inlanders, like the people that they know are on the other side of the water from them that have a different sort of magic. And it has changed shape depending on where it's been presented, but in some, the participants make sound and kind of not music, but sounding together, and some they make objects together, and the objects is their magic. It's their way that they communicate like with and through the environment. And that one will continue to evolve. I don't think I've figured it out exactly.
Yeah. But I think that's what's nice about the approach. I mean, is thinking about what you're saying earlier about this thing of kind of what you're saying about it's constructing a world, but it's also, you know, a kind of open inquiry. It's not an attempt to present a sort of totalizing vision, which is such a relief to hear, just because I feel like world building is such a kind of buzzword, like across like most cultural like spheres right now. And you know, so is like these kind of like immersive art experiences where you'll be in this room with this like specially designed sound system, and it makes you feel like this is what it's like to like lie in this river and be in this forest. And you're not trying to do that kind of thing where at no point are you trying to pull the wool over anyone's eyes and kind of like put them completely in this thing. There's always this process of like, you know, what might happen, and a kind of open-ended curiosity.
I mean, I think the conventional view on my practice versus VR is that VR is like high fidelity, and it's technically requires like a degree of technicality that seems superior. But it's like less fidelity, actually. In some ways it's less engaging, and because also you're focusing on visuality so extremely, like it's just not how our bodies work. Like our bodies are bringing in all sorts of sensory information all of the time, like so much so that we can't process it all consciously. And I think there are people in VR that are playing with different senses, and you know, also there's problems with the vestibular like system and VR that people are also trying to solve. But it's like, yeah, I don't know, I feel a little like disappointed, or like just like when people talk about VR, and I'm just like, oh, we already have that tool. Like it's, and even before LARP, I think there's pretend play, and there's like, maybe we get cut off from it because it's something that children are only supposed to do. And then once you grow up, like things are real or something.
Yeah. It's like your reality is like always already augmented by all these different things.
Exactly. It's like someone else's reality that you're just deciding to agree that's real. Whereas like with children, it is more co-creative. I mean, there's social pressures to the imaginary worlds of children too. But there's like more of a like crack for creation. And I think that that's what we need more of. Like we don't need more auteurs like telling us their vision. I mean, I think that can be relaxing and nice, but I think we need more, or maybe not relaxing and nice, but like relaxing to like sit back, like watch someone's creation. Like there's something enjoyable about that. And I don't want to say that there's no use for that. I mean, that can be great, but I think we do need more spaces where it can be co-created, or we like are given some space to add to that world or vision or whatever, especially because stories do shape our world. And are they like hierarchies, or like is it like a story Darwinism, or is there like if you think about it on those terms, like it's not even how the world works. Like things are more about the environment and like the environment selecting, and there's a lot more co-creation and responsiveness, like laterally or horizontally. But I think there has to be more spaces for co-creation, and I think that's maybe an older form. Like I spent time in Indonesia, and especially at that point, maybe it's not like this anymore, but like there was so much like storytelling, like, you know, poems as flirting and courtship, and like dances as like social interactions. Like, I mean, so many other like non-Western cultures have more space for us, or hopefully they still do. Like there's more ways, art and even entertainment, there's more ways to be interactive and co-creative than I think this kind of idea that you go to theater or a museum and like take in someone's like amazing vision that like you aren't able to have because you're just a plebe, or like you're just an audience member or something, or I don't know, like
where there is interaction, it's like you choose to eat this brand of cereal or this brand of cereal. That was the thing, and they did that Black Mirror thing for Netflix famously, where that was literally the thing, and you can just imagine where that data is getting logged. So it's a very narrow conception of what interaction should look like, even as, because interaction is often peddled as part of like the culture that you're criticizing here as well, I think, right? Where there's this desire to like, oh, it's engaging the user and like you're involved in this thing in some way, and it's kind of like, but that's just to kind of make this fiction that's being presented to you more real and more kind of like, you know, adding weight to that rather than allowing you to have a say in what, you know, is actually unfolding here.
Yeah, I mean, like look at a video game. Like it is very interactive, and you do have like a lot of say, but like at the end of the day, you're like stuck to the edges of the world, and you're stuck to whatever's been programmed, and like you have to program a lot. Like it's very labor intensive to like reach the fidelity of our world. But isn't it funny, like in a LARP space, even like, especially the kind of LARPs that I do, like materially independent, so no costumes, no like, but like there are no edges. Like in a way, there's like whatever edges exist in real life. Obviously, like defying gravity is hard, but like other than that, like in terms of like your imagination and what you can like find to simulate, there's no bounds. Like you have the bounds of the world that you've all agreed upon, but those are actually like I mean, they're very powerful in one way, because the power of like all agreeing to that and like mostly sticking to it, but then there's so many like gaps and holes in that you can exploit or like explore if you want to. It actually affords so much more freedom than something like a video game, which is already like way more interactive than looking at a painting or going to see a movie or a theater piece or something. But like, I've always felt that about technology. Like you're always bounded by the limits of the technology and how you have to set it up. Like, we're not in a world yet where like AI can like spawn themselves materially, or like, you know, like things need to be programmed still. So
yeah, And then I guess thinking about this kind of these discussions of like virtuality and so on and so forth, I was curious if there's ways that like you've done these kind of LARPs and workshops, obviously like IRL and then also over Zoom and those kinds of things, and how that kind of that shift works. Because I think it's interesting in terms of you can talk about like the pandemic, and I think this is true to a certain extent where you do kind of like lose a sense of embodiment by spending all this time online and so on and so forth. But it's also a shift to different, you're not really losing embodiment, you're shifting to a different style of embodiment where you're, you're inhabiting and presenting yourself in a different kind of way. And I guess I was just interested in that shift and how you've like thought about that, if you've thought about that.
Yeah, I think about it a lot. And I mean, I'd be curious because you've had an experience with it, but I try to get people aware and into their senses in the space that they're in. And I feel like there's a lot you can play with, like having the screen off or on. Like the screen is weird. It's like not how we actually talk or interact with people. There's not like a mirror right above people's heads or on the side where you can see everything you're doing and like spend the time looking at yourself mostly if you want to.
I feel like I should turn the screen off like right now.
I like to turn the screen off so that people can be more with themselves, but then you're limited to like the audio quality on online platforms, which is like, because there's encoding, it's not the greatest quality. I think if you're open to it, there's a lot that can happen. And with Skinship, like I think the first couple of times I had really strong experiences, even though the like audio wasn't very good, and I felt really connected to people. Like, and also you can play with the audio quality. Like if someone doesn't sound very strong, they're like further away or you feel less connected to them. So I hope that there's some kind of feeding into it, but not, I think it's difficult because you are missing so much sensory and nonverbal information. So, and you're right, it is like a different embodiment. Like we don't just lose our bodies the minute we like look at a screen. I think it's the lack of movement and being able to move with people and be close to people. Oh God, pheromones, like chemicals. And like, I think that's the issue with screen-based technologies is the lack of movement. And I would love to do like a walking LARP or something, but it's hard, data and connecting in groups. But I think audio somehow seems to be a great way to overcome that, or just using just video and no talk, like separating the information a bit helps to create like a different feeling. I do really miss being with groups. I miss it a lot, but I actually have loved the chance that this has given me to try out different forms because it's just different. I think like the Skinship LARP online is like its own thing, like, and it's cool. I think that I've like figured out like a way. I mean, it could be developed. I also feel like it's hard to ask people to be online for more than 2 hours, like intensively. So, and then I did this one LARP called Radio Silence, and we had characters communicating through just songs. Like we would send, like one song would be a question and the other song would be an answer. And that was a really powerful experience for me. And I was just, then I was like, even more just, your imagination. I really like imagined this full on like romance and all these different details with this other person that I didn't even know who I was LARPing with until in the debrief. And their story was completely different, but it was such a strong, that just like feeling of like team crushing, like so much more about your story than what's actually happening, but just so strong and feels so real at the same time. And so I think there's like, it just, that's the like power and the danger, I guess, of like online communication is that it is, you have to fill in so many gaps on your own, maybe. And then you can play with that and have it be like a powerful experience, or it can feel really empty and frustrating because you are missing that information.
I like how you emphasize that it cuts both ways, because it's almost like if I sort of think back to my experience participating in skinship, where there's this very common experience now that we are we're doing now, spending all this time on Zoom, and everyone talks about Zoom fatigue, and there's a sense of you're somehow doing more to kind of compensate for this thing, and it's draining your body in a way you can't quite pinpoint. There's just something that's just different and more taxing about communicating in this form than it is to communicating via even on the phone or something. But then there's also, in the presence of that deficit, there's a kind of buy-in, or you commit yourself to almost more than you might otherwise do, because less is automatic and less is ever present. And you do have to then pay attention to what those kind of technologies of, staying in sync with someone and attuning someone on. I love that you've the example that kind of sounds the most compelling or exciting is where music is so integral to that. And I remember thinking back to the beginning of the skinship LARP, where there's a kind of introductory game where you will have to call out a number, and you're not allowed to sort of synchronize who's going to call out the number when. And if anyone if anyone speaks at the same time, then you have to start over. And there was 15 people or something. I think we got it right. There was only the first or second time. And that felt really kind of quite chilling. When you have that sense of well, something's weird has just happened here. I remember speaking to my friend afterwards, who's a teacher who uses the same thing to try to get her kids to calm down. And it just doesn't, the whole point is basically it doesn't work, and everyone gets bored after 3 attempts. And settles down after failing the game.
Oh.
But yeah, to experience that thing of you can be in a virtual room of 15 people you don't know, and all the screens turned off, and it's just this stream of audio, and somehow there's some kind of communication going on that allows you to coordinate yourselves in that way. Felt kind of was probably the most the most kind of profound takeaway I think I had from the whole experience in a way. And if that sounds really cheesy, but
yeah, I mean, I think other kind of LARPy things I've done online that do that same exercise, we've also gotten it right away. And maybe there's something about being together voluntarily. And then also maybe you're extra careful because, the audio quality is not always so good, and that there might be some feedback or cutting out. And so you're extra gentle in the spaces in between, I think. But yeah, because you were talking about how there's maybe a development of some kind of psychic power.
Yeah, there's some kind of process of mental synchronization going on there. And normally what that's sort of, in a lot of the literature on that, what that's attributed to is sort of reading, unconscious reading of somatic cues or something, where, what looks like a sort of mental process is really embedded in the body. And that's and then it's really interesting to then witness that where, okay, the body is gone, the void, any kind of input of this person's presence is gone, but somehow you've set up a structure in place that allows something like that to kind of be possible. And this might be a good pivot to talk about telepathy, I guess, and upcoming projects related to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting to try to puzzle out, especially when you cut off the screen. I mean, I don't know if it's easier or harder to mirror visually with people on the screen, because I look at myself when I look at you. It's hard not to. So it's my training to myself as well as you. But I think that's what's interesting about the audio, right? You really sense in the audio. It's you're searching with your other senses in the audio. I don't know if you ever have a sense of that, where I feel my eyes are searching through the audio as well. All the other senses are trying to contribute what they can, which just maybe leads to just a heightened sense of awareness. And maybe you're just syncing up even more because your other senses are trying to fill in the gaps, I guess.
Yeah. It's the thing of putting on a blindfold, I guess, and then the way your tactile sense is suddenly completely different.
Yeah. Or I lost my sense of smell and taste when I had a sinus infection, and I was like, wow, I'm really like taking this as an opportunity, like feel the textures of my food, like just like, wow, there's actually so much information there that's not just how it tastes, of course, and of course, but then it's like, oh, really, like I can create a world like a taste, not a taste sensation, but like I can create like an awareness and an enjoyable experience, even though I'm missing something that normally would create enjoyment. But yeah, I think it's interesting, like when I'm looking into telepathy for my new LARP that I'm writing called PSY SOMA TEK. And I've been interested in like ESP and psi techniques since I was a child, like really quite obsessed with it. Would do exercises with my sister on my own. So it's kind of a fun way to get back into that space. But what I've noticed is that the remote viewing techniques, so I don't know how much you know about this, but like the CIA had these psychic weapons, these people, either psychics they brought in to work on military stuff, or people within the military that they thought would be good at it. And so there's this particular way of remote viewing, telepathic kind of sensing. And as I'm reading through it, I was like, oh, wow, like there's a lot here that is using all of the senses, or like sensory material of like texture to figure out what an object is that they're remote viewing. And that's quite important. So I got really excited. And actually, Ingo Swann was one person who helped develop it with the Stanford Research Institute and the CIA. And he was an artist. So he was a painter and had trained in New York somewhere. And he actually brought in stuff from Gestalt and Adolf, what's his name? Art and visual perception, a psychology of the creative eye, by Rudolf Arnheim. Yeah. So he brought in stuff to the process from that book, and the idea of ideograms and how like children make these little, scribbles that represent something, and it's like the movement of it that is important, and that it represents movement and energy. And so he brought stuff like that into shaping this remote viewing technique. So there's just some crazy esoteric sides to the military, right? But that's not what my project will focus on, more that it's this kind of renegade group of people developing techniques for when the technocratic-suprastructures fall apart. So all these ways in which, Zoom and like computers, when that's all gone, because it's going to be gone at some point, probably, right? So getting back, and essentially like it's really like rediscovering or reconnecting to these things that already exist for humans, and other cultures have really developed quite highly.
Yeah, alternatives to neural interfaces, I guess, given the impending collapse of those infrastructures. It sort of makes me think of there's that really cringe headline I saw on like ArtNet or something about Marina Abramovich doing these, like she teaches you her mindfulness method while you upload your files. And I just love this like bizarre contrast of like, while you're kind of like, folders and folders of like raw movies and like, like untranscribed like interviews or whatever evaporate into the ether, you're kind of like located back in this thing. Or there's this rhyme between like the kind of strange instantaneity of like the internet and things like like telepathic communication. There's a kind of, it makes sense how you might use one to understand the other as a kind of metaphor for the other, and then to kind of imply this quite like direct relationship is interesting.
Yeah, but it's not immaterial, right? Like there's so much materiality and energy that goes into our computers and our, on one hand, the technology requires a lot of external materiality and energy gotten from other places, whereas like telepathy requires a lot of like internal energy from you basically, and a cultivation, like an internal cultivation that takes a lot of concentration and patience. And it's just interesting to me, why does that feel harder than using technology? Is it just because it's external and it's not like having to do the effort ourselves? I don't know. I also feel this way about drugs. Like, I think when I was in my early 20s and experimenting, I was like, okay, well, this is great. And this is kind of a pathway or that opens up, or like a door that you open. But somehow I had already been meditating or trying to meditate. And it's like, I come to like a similar place sometimes with meditation. It just like takes longer. It's like longer, it's harder. I have to like view a lot worse parts of myself, or like grapple with more of reality. I mean, I don't know. Like, I mean, what do you think? Like, is it just that we've like offloaded the labor to other beings and energy sources, people? I mean, you know, like we're very privileged, like in the West, like.
Yeah, I think there's a desire for instantaneity, right? And a kind of smooth, seamless experience of reality, which is what I'd liked about the WeTransfer Abramovich method thing, was where it's that contrast between instantaneity and duration seems really pronounced there, where, you know, if you look at like a lot of like the exercise, I mean, like the brand partnership is like just ridiculous to behold. But beyond that, like if you look at the actual kind of what those exercises, as she's advocated for them elsewhere, kind of consistent, it's things like writing out your name, but doing it so slowly that it like takes an entire hour, or like sipping a glass of water and visualizing like each droplet as it slowly moves through your body. And it's like, well, like if you transpose that to like the WeTransfer world, that's just like bad UX design. Do you know what I mean? That's just, it's like the kind of the opposite of the convenience and instantaneity. You know, we're sold that so much that I think there's a distrust of any kind of like durational process that involves friction and tension and difficulty. You know, there's a desire for like this kind of smoothed over reality. I won't keep you for too much longer because I've been in this call for a really long time. But the one other thing that I was curious to ask you about is, I guess, talking about this kind of like the, you know, the disembodied nature of our times and the way our screen time is so like rapidly accelerated over the past like year, and, you know, all the kind of already present trends that's kind of that, you know, it's kind of concretized or accelerated or, you know, made much more present than they might have otherwise been. The way I think a lot of people are spending more time online now in their spaces, you'll have like various like alt Twitter accounts and various aliases, and you'll be on these different Discord servers where there's different kind of community conventions or, you know, lenses through which you understand yourself. And it seems like there's a kind of affinity there between the sort of the process of, you know, designing a fictional culture and the process of how you kind of cultivate a malleable, mutable community or identity online in that space. And I wondered if, yeah, your thoughts about the way that things like LARP and things like the kind of exercises beyond that you put forward in your work form a sort of like tool set within that context, or if you feel like there's a sort of like another relationship going on there on some level. And is there a way in which those protocols kind of scale up, as it were?
Ooh, yeah, juicy question. Well, you know, where we are mostly with the internet now, I mean, is a far cry from where it was in the 90s, where it was like you could kind of be whoever you wanted. And because it was so low fidelity in a way, like you could just have a different name every time you went on whatever kind of chat. And there's been such a move towards centralization, not only of like the actual internet and platforms and how information's being organized, but also of the self, like, and like, I mean, I feel this pressure myself with my Twitter account. I feel like, God, it should be more professional, and it shouldn't just like have my like weird, like, I actually liked Twitter at first because it felt like kind of a weird void. Like I didn't have very many friends on it, and I could just say what I wanted, and I loved that. And then now it's like, oh shit, like there's philosophers and scientists like following, like I better be more professional and like only say things that make me sound smart. And like, I mean, that is maybe more of what the internet had been, like that you could just have these fictional selves online. Maybe there's a move towards that more with like, I'm really into like VR chat, even though it's kind of, I don't have a PC, so I can't actually use it. I feel like that's a very playful space. I think there's a lot of weird stuff happening on it, but like people seem to really like, I just got into Second Life for the first time.
A bit late. I didn't know Second Life was still running even.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty chunky and like,
yeah.
I mean, I think VR is actually kind of an interesting, weird space for that. But I think in the same way that like cryptocurrency is really cool because it can allow for so many different things to happen, like good or bad, depending on how you feel about their politics or values. Like it is a genuinely kind of open space in the way that like the internet just has evolved. Not that there aren't open spaces on the internet anymore. I don't think that's strictly true, but it's just like they've become so dominated by these kind of centralized forces. Like you could look at cryptocurrency, like once it's regulated, it's not going to be as a free open space. It might be a little safer for some people, but like it's not going to be as free basically. And I don't know how they scale, except for I think like the facilitation processes and the interpersonal processes do scale. And I think they do spread to other parts of your life, like if you practice them over and over again. And LARP isn't the only place to do that. Like I think it does for me feel like the most creative space because you're not doing just that. Like you're using these interpersonal negotiations to create something. And I think I think there's some other probably forms of co-design or like theater of the oppressed kind of do that too, for sure. But I think there's like a certain playfulness that needs to come back into how we interact with each other online without it. And that I think it is so much more connected to our quote unquote real selves, which has consequences, and it can be quite awful. Because on the one hand, it's not like a repeated game in some ways if you're just interacting with someone randomly and you think there's some people who can think they can treat people however they want to. And because it's not a repeated game, there's no accountability. And I think on the other hand, like, because of that, exactly, it can have such like gigantic real life consequences for some people. And I think something like LARP helps to heal that, like, because you do have you have accountability to your group, at least in the like hours of the LARP. And maybe people don't always respect that, but there's some idea that there's different levels. Like there's the personal level where you have the skills to like renegotiate or communicate that you don't like something or you want something to change or you love it actually and you want more. And then there's sort of kind of like different mechanisms for talking to the organizers or stopping play or something like that. And can you imagine trying to do that on Twitter? Like it's just
yeah.
Like, okay, you have 160 characters or whatever it is now, like to say something like, and I think there's a lot of like, well, here's our code of conduct, like no bullying, no disrespectful, blah, blah, blah. Like, but that doesn't actually allow for people to fully participate. It's either like participate under these contexts, which are often like well-meaning and there's nothing wrong with them per se, but it doesn't actually like, and if you don't, then you're out. And it excludes people actually in a way. And they don't learn how to socialize. I think this is why probably like incels and like things like that are such a like problem now, is because there's no new models and it's like either you like do the thing you're supposed to do or you're out. And it's an older problem. I mean, you used to teach children, and I used to bring this 4 or 5-year-olds, like whenever there was an emotional issue or strife or fight between 2 kids, I'd gather them all together and we'd all like sit and talk about like what the kids should do, like what's not good, what's that, and like it stopped play or whatever, and that from an adult view, it's like, oh, that's not very productive. Like if you think about it in terms of like a work meeting or like a date or something. But in the end, like, in this context of the children, like they all felt really empowered, like they helped each other. And I was thinking about it, like it's a huge cognitive burden to have someone in the group that's not a part of the group. Like it's a huge burden. And when you scale that out to like how we deal with each other on a societal level, like it's a burden that we don't even realize that's there. And I think more ways to bring people in, and I think Twitter and stuff like that can be a tool. Like you can talk to people all over the world and like see different things, but I think there's not enough focus on like interpersonal skills that could create inclusion. And how can we have like repeated social games online that aren't status games, basically, because that's basically where we're at. And people have integrated that to such an extreme level that it's become really, I don't want to say destructive, but like painful.
Torturous, I guess. And it's torturous to participate in an experience. But I think it ties it all back together in a way where online spaces are a huge part of this, but not the kind of the only driver behind it, where it does seem like the mood of our age is this one of kind of isolation and antagonism and like competition, and not to get like too like macro level, like polemic about it. But the thing that's kind of absent from that is, well, what is the kind of the shared space we inhabit, the kind of like the quote unquote like consensus reality. And that interpersonal kind of impersonal space, which we're all like accountable to. And I think what makes LARP, what I guess was maybe in the back of my mind as I was like asking that question, is when you're doing something like LARP, that's like the object of design basically, is that interpersonal, the shared world, which you're all accountable to in a very impersonal way that's not kind of driven by like intense like affectation or something, or a sense of like moral justice. It's like there's this thing that we're all part of, that we're kind of bound to in a way. And that's a really hard thing to like implement in any space today, I think.
I think that's why something like Discord is maybe more of or VR chat, like these social spaces, like interactive social spaces, are more of a place where you could cultivate something like that. Whereas Twitter or Instagram, it's really hard because you're really presenting yourself as an individual in a sea of other voices or other individuals' accounts. In some ways, I feel like people are like longing for things like this and tools like this. Like I see a lot of like a lot of horrible things, but then a lot of great things. I think there's like more somatically based like social justice stuff, and like especially in the United States, which is just really like so awe-inspiring to see. And I think there's lots of people enacting it in their day-to-day lives. And being a collective is a desirable thing. I think we need tools to kind of bridge between like our desires as individuals and like what it means to be a part of a collective. I think there's a lot of baggage of like what it meant in the past to be a part of a group. And I see something like LARP as a really nice, and I'm sure it can happen other ways. I just feel like for me, this has been the most potent example of it cumulatively, like not just one LARP, but like also the process of LARP and the process that you, and the communities and the groups, like you create the group and then you create groups around the LARPs. Like you create a group, a sense of the group from the individual interactions, if that makes sense. Like the group doesn't exist.
Yeah, prior to
but,
this thing
but
that, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Like you are the group emerges from the individuals. And that group is unique and like something that couldn't have existed without those individuals. And that these individuals have a sense of agency, but they also have a sense of like accountability in a way. But I think accountability is used in this negative term in the West, basically, because there's no sense of like the comfort and the love, I think, like the genuine like love that other cultures form their groups, like that there's something like so heartening about belonging no matter what. But I think we really long for that, but we don't have any tools to like cultivate that in a healthy way in the West. Like when we see like groups, we see fascism, we see like like domination. And if you don't submit to that dominant view of what the group should be, you're eliminated, you're ostracized. I think that we're at this really great juncture of hopefully like melding the best of different worlds and like healing what has been problematic in other ways of dealing with like forming groups, collectives, societies. I mean, who knows where it will go, but I think we're at this exciting juncture where we can form some new ways of relating. But it requires attention to it. Like you can't just decide something and then it comes true. Like you really have to work at it.
Yeah, it's a practice and a process, which is what the LARP thing reveals, I guess.
Yeah, and it's cumulative, and it's not just like, oh, I'll decide that this is it.
Yeah, there isn't a solution or an algorithm or a kind of button that's going to fix it all. Thank you so much for talking. This has been such a fun conversation.
Yes, as always.
To hear more podcasts from Tank, you can subscribe on all major podcast platforms or follow us on SoundCloud. The theme music for this podcast is by Himera.